So you remember that John and his fairy betrothed went down the great tree, and they harvested the fruit, the apples, the pears, the hazelnuts, and they brought them back to the emperor in the emperor's court, and they presented them to the emperor, and they claimed they're half the kingdom. And of course, the emperor was entirely just, and he accepted the fruits, and he granted them. No, that didn't happen. The emperor said, well, yes, very good. Well, come back tomorrow, and we'll talk about your reward. And then he called his counselors into session, for he had seen how beautiful the fairy of the lake was, and he wanted her for himself. And he said to his counselors, maybe I was a little hasty with this half a kingdom for the fruits of the great tree. And I'm wondering if any of you can think of a way that I can get out of this. The one counselor spoke up, and he said, Your Highness, the answer is simplicity itself. Arrest him and cut off his head. And the emperor said, What do I pay you for? Do you really think I couldn't have come up with that one myself? Do you know what would happen? I've sent heralds all over the kingdom promising half the kingdom to the one who would climb the tree and bring back the marvelous fruits. And if I just cut off his head, how do you think that would sit? I'd have a revolution on my hands. Any of you other geniuses have any ideas? One of the other counselors spoke up and he said, What your Majesty says is true. But the people aren't very well versed in the subtleties of contract law. And I think you can set some conditions that maybe weren't fully explained by the heralds. I think it's within your right to say that you need some proof that this person could achieve such a marvelous thing as to climb the great tree. And you could ask him to do another task, and you could make this task something that he could never possibly do. And if he doesn't do this task, it would prove that he is indeed a fraud and deserves to have his head cut off. And the emperor said, Now I like where this is going. What task should we set for it? And the counselor said, Well, you could have him clear the forest behind the castle as far as the eye can see, and to level all the hills and to plant vines there, and not only that, but to have the vines produce fruit and have the fruit ripen and have it there so that you can have ripe grapes from your vineyard as far as the eye can see behind the castle tomorrow morning. And if he can't do that, then his head can be struck off. And so when John came the next day to claim his half the kingdom, this condition was presented to him, that he cleared the great forest behind the castle, level the hills, plant vines, have the vines produce fruit, and have the fruit ripen by morning, or his head would be removed from his shoulders. And when he came home, the fairy was there, and she said, Well, what news? He said, Not good. Not good. And he explained the condition that had been placed on him. And she said, The one who placed this condition upon you wants only your destruction. But you never mind. You go to bed. I'll take care of it. And so John went to bed. And that evening the fairy went out. And she took her wings and she threw them down on the ground. And where they landed, 2 lions sprung up with their hats in their hands. And they said, "How may we serve you, mistress?" And she said, "Do you see the great woods and the hills behind the castle?" "We do," they said. She said, "Well, the forest needs to be cleared and the hills need to be leveled and vines need to be planted there as far as the eye can see to the very horizon itself. And the vines need to produce fruit and the fruit needs to ripen so the emperor may have ripe grapes tomorrow morning." And the lion said, "It shall be done." And the lions roared, and suddenly thousands of lions appeared, and they began tearing down the trees and leveling the hills and planting vines and tying up the tendrils. And the vines produced fruit, and the fruit ripened, and in the morning ripe grapes from the vineyard as far as the eye could see behind the castle were brought to the emperor for his breakfast, which he did not entirely enjoy. And he called his council into session, and he said, "That didn't work out as planned. Do you geniuses have any more ideas?" And another counselor spoke up, and he said, "We need to set another condition. And I think I know one that'll set him back a bit." "What is it?" said the emperor. And the counselor said, "Demand that he bring you the flute that plays of its own accord, that plays music by itself. The only way he can obtain such a flute is to have it made by the spirits at the bottom of the sea. And even if he got them to agree to make it for him, it would take them 7 years to make such a flute. And if nothing else, it will buy you a lot of time, and a lot of accidents can happen in 7 years." "Sounds reasonable," said the emperor. And so when John came the next day to claim his half the kingdom, he was presented with yet another condition and task. And if he were to show himself in the kingdom without that flute that played of its own accord, that could only be made by the spirits that live at the bottom of the sea, well, then his head would be struck off. So he returned to the fairy, and she looked at him and said, "What is it this time?" And he told her. And she said, "The one who presented you with this condition wants only your destruction. But what help I can give, I will give. This is a difficult task, but the help I can give is this." And she removed the ring from her finger. And she said, "Take my ring. And when you don't know where to go, throw the ring down and follow where it leads. And it might be that it leads you to where you need to be." So the next morning, John headed to the edge of the woods with a heavy heart, and he threw the ring down and he followed where it led. He followed it for a long time, or a short time as they say, but eventually it led him to the shore of the great salty sea, the great Mother Ocean itself. And there he stopped and picked up the ring and considered his situation. And he looked out at the sea with the waves crashing on the shore. And he realized the utter impossibility of him getting to the realm at the deepest part of the sea. And in despair and grief for his situation, he sat down and he let out a great sigh. A sigh so great that the sigh man heard it and turned his face and appeared next to John's shoulder and said, "Why have you called me with such a sigh?" And John explained that he was tasked with getting a flute that could play of its own accord. And the Psi-man said, well, to obtain that, you have to get to the realm at the bottom of the sea. And the spirits there can make such a flute, but it will take them 7 years to do so. And during that time, you must keep vigil. And you must promise not to sleep one wink during 7 years of vigil while that flute is being made. If you sleep during that time, they will stop work and they will break the flute. And you will leave with nothing. Are you willing to accept that condition? And John said, I am. Well then, said the Psi-man, get on my back, and I'll take you. And John jumped up on the back of the Psi-man, and the Psi-man walked down along the bottom of the ocean until they arrived at the deepest part of the ocean, the realm of King Moman, the king of the spirits of the sea. And he was presented at that court, and King Moman said, tell me, fellow, do you come here of your own free will? And John said, I do not. This is not my idea. I come here by compulsion. And King Moman said, it's well that you answered so. For had you answered in any other way, I would have had your head struck off. What is it you want? And John explained about the flute that could play itself. And King Moman said, my people can make such a flute, but you must sit vigil for the 7 years it will take them, and you must not sleep. And if you sleep at all during that time, they will stop work and they will destroy the flute. Do you agree to these terms? And John said, I do. And he was taken to a chamber, and there the spirits under the sea began their work to make the flute that would play of its own accord. They harvested reeds from the edges of the sea, and they brought shells and bits of silver and scales of fish. And they began their work. And at each step, they had to do rituals and say prayers and sing songs and make enchantments. It took a very long time. For 3 years, they worked night and day without stop. But at the end of 3 years, John's eyelids grew heavy, and his head began to nod. And one of the spirits noticed, and he said, John, you're asleep. You're sleeping. That's it. We'll break the flute. We're going to break the flute right now. And he said, no, I wasn't sleeping. It looked like it. Your eyes were closed. No, John said. I was pondering a difficult question. What question is that? Well, he said, I was wondering, which is more? Blades of grass in the world, or leaves on all the trees and all the bushes and all the plants? We don't know, said the spirits. But you know what? We'll go count them. So they left that place, they left him there alone, and they went out to every corner of the world, and they counted every blade of grass, and they counted every leaf on every tree and every shrub and every plant. And they totaled them up, and they compared their tallies. And it gave John enough time to sleep a little and restore himself and wake up again before they returned. And when they came back, they said, there are exactly 2 more blades of grass than there are leaves. Good to know, said John.
Thank you very much.
And they set to work again on the flute, singing their songs, doing their rituals, saying their incantations, building the flute. For 3 more years they worked. But again, John's eyelids grew heavy, and his head began to nod. And they said, John, you're sleeping. That's it. We're breaking the flute right now. No, said John, I was contemplating another difficult question. What is it, said the spirit. Well, he said, I was wondering, which is more, grains of sand in the sea, or all the fish and snails and crabs and sea life in all the oceans and all the rivers and all the world? We don't no. We'll go count them and leave you here, and we'll be right back. And they went out and they counted all the grains of sand in the sea and all the sea life and the snails and the fishes and all the sea creatures. And they did their tally and they brought back the answer. And it gave John enough time to sleep a little bit and refresh himself and wake up again before they returned. And they worked for some months more. And one day they said, well, the flute is almost finished. It's fully functional, it will play by itself, does everything it needs to do, but we need to decorate and polish it. And he said, to hell with that. And he grabbed the flute, and he threw the ring down, and he followed it up the sea to the shore. And the spirits followed him, and they said, wait, what about the polishing and the decoration? He said, it's good enough. And he followed the ring back home. And he brought it to the court of the emperor and to the emperor himself, and he presented it to them. And then he excused himself, and he went home to sleep, for he was very tired. And he slept a deep and dreamless sleep for 3 days. Now during that time, one of the courtiers said, well, let's test this thing out. And they ordered the flute to play a song. And the flute did indeed play a very enchanting, beautiful song from the depths of the sea. It held in it the power of the shining of the moon on the waters. It was lovely, enchanting. They were mesmerized. And then one of the courtiers said, let's have some dance music. I want a fast dance tune. And the flute obliged. I played a fast dance tune, and they all began to dance. And the flute picked up the tempo. And they began to dance faster. They danced as if they were in a competition with each other to see who could do the most intricate steps, who could leap the highest. They were filled with joy, they were dancing, and the flute picked up the pace. And they played faster, and they continued to dance, but now they began to get tired. And they tried to tell the flute to stop. But the flute played faster, and they were compelled to dance. They danced and danced on, and the flute played faster, and still they danced, and they wanted to stop, but they couldn't, and they begged and they pleaded, but the flute played on. They played on, and they were compelled to dance until at last all of their hearts burst, and they fell down dead on the floor, and still their feet danced, and their arms writhed to the tune of the flute. Their corpses danced on the floor, and at the end of 3 days, John, in his sleep, heard a voice. It was the voice of a flute. And he called to him and said, John, John, wake up. Come and see, I have disposed of the emperor and his whole court. The palace is empty. It is yours for the taking. And John woke up, and he and the fairy went to the palace, and they claimed not only half, but the whole kingdom. And then there was indeed a great wedding with him and the fairy, and they became king and queen of that place. And they ruled for a long time, taking the good times and the bad times, but always remembering the poor and the unfortunate and the orphans and the widows. That's the way it was. The whole story was witnessed by a spider who had a web up in the rafters of the great palace. And she carried the story, and when she laid her eggs, the little spiderlets hatched out, and they carried the story, and they were carried on silken strands out by the wind through the window of the great hall of the palace out into the world. And so they carried the story out there. It was carried by the spider people for many generations, and that's why the story is so beautifully woven together and has so many strands and connections. But one day, 1 year, there was a fly flying at dusk, and a swallow was chasing it. And the fly was trying to get away from the swallow. And he flew right into one of the webs of one of those spiders, and the swallow caught the fly just at that moment, and the webs went over the wings of the swallow, and the story went into the swallow, and it was carried by the swallow people for many generations of swallows. But 1 year, a swallow made its nest over a little creek. a blue jay came. And you know, sometimes blue jays will throw the eggs of another bird out of the nest and lay their own in its place, and that's what happened. And that egg went down and it broke on a rock in the stream and it was eaten by little fish. And the story went into them and they were eaten by bigger fish. And the story went into them and they were eaten by a salmon. A young salmon who carried that story out to the sea, which is why the story has its salty flavor. And for many generations it was carried by the salmon people from saltwater to fresh, back and forth. But one year a fisherman caught some salmon and he gave it to my friend Phil Norgard, who smoked it. And last night I ate a piece of that smoked salmon and the story went into me, and now I told you.